Hi everyone, my name is Elijah Perrier and today I'll be talking about my paper, Operationalizing Extended Cognition, Formal Metrics for Corporate Knowledge and Legal Accountability. The basic question that the paper tries to address is, does the use of AI expand the bounds of corporate knowledge? AI is reshaping what corporations know, and we know that corporate liability turns on what firms knew, should have known, or deliberately avoided knowing. Traditional knowledge attribution locates what a corporate knows based on the agents, either individuals or collectives. However, AI agents and infrastructure are now being incorporated within corporate systems. This includes large language models and information pipelines, agentic workflows, and other processes. So the core claim of the paper is AI can make knowledge acquisition fast and cheaply available at scale. And so then I argue that this, in certain cases, extends the bounds of corporate knowledge. What is it that AI changes? Well, in the paper, I argue that AI compresses what I call epistemic distance, making it quicker and cheaper to obtain knowledge. This includes vector search, the use of autonomous agents, and continuous processes. But AI systems can also make corporate cognition probabilistic. We know that frontier models hallucinate, they miscalibrate, there can be issues with distribution shift, interception, and so on. So AI can, in a sense, make information gathering and generation cheaper, faster, but potentially noisier. And for this reason, I argue that the effect of these sophisticated information processing systems must be assessed along two axes, those of efficiency and validated reliability. So the main question I'm therefore addressing is, when AI systems are being used in corporate decision-making, such as AI agents or other information systems, how should we define and measure corporate knowledge in a way that's legally usable? We want a framework that can answer when a fact, phi, is within a firm's epistemic reach. We want to understand, how do we measure the feasibility of inquiry, time and cost, and also the reliability of the method. What's the error rate? How do we map these measurements to doctrinal categories such as actual knowledge, constructive knowledge, willful blindness, and so on? What types of audit artifacts should exist to make knowledge claims falsifiable and contestable? The core idea of the paper then is to extend an idea from Clark and Chalmers called extended cognition. This is the idea that a corporation's mind is the functional cognitive system formed by its people, which include their roles and incentives, artifacts, including documents, infrastructure, including databases and procedures. The basic idea is this: you take the sum collection of what a corporation is and look at its parts and ask, to what extent does that part or component function as an information processing unit? Does it function like memory, search, inference, or monitoring under corporate control? If so, then it's part of this epistemic picture which informs how a corporation generates and acquires knowledge. The idea then is that extended cognition can motivate treating knowledge as a system-level capability, not just situated within the minds of individual or collective agents. So an example is, for example, at a bank where I used to work, a customer may make a cash withdrawal above a certain threshold, $10,000. This may trigger a threshold, a currency transaction reporting obligation. Where does this information live, though? The evidence of this knowledge from the corporation's perspective lives inside distributed logs. No single agent may actually have the full picture. By contrast, if AI agents are used, they may be able to synthesize and have access to a greater range of information. So the question here is whether the proposition here, phi, in this case, whether a threshold of transaction has been made, is procedurally discoverable given the firm's broad extended mind. So not just what the clerk thought, not just what the back office thought. So in this talk, I'm going to be talking about this concept of extended cognition. I'll be giving a very general framework for how we might think about this. I'll be talking about some of the concepts behind how we assess efficiency and validity, and then I'll be briefly mapping to how this would apply to reasoning about whether firms have actual and constructive knowledge and so on. So why should we care about this? Well, courts routinely ask procedural questions about corporate knowledge. Could the firm have found out quickly? Would the method have been reliable? Did the firm design systems to avoid knowing? Doctrines that attribute knowledge to corporations are well known, those of agency and identification based on individual agents such as employees, officers, mental states. There are doctrines of collective knowledge, which can aggregate fragments of information where no single agent or collective had that information in their mind per se. There are doctrines of constructive knowledge, where knowledge is imputed, where reasonable inquiry would have revealed a fact, and doctrines of willful blindness. My thesis is that in an AI era, we ought to be looking at these questions of whether firms have a procedurally feasible and valid and reliable process for acquiring knowledge, and that this should then shape how we attribute knowledge to corporations. So there are two key components of what I'm arguing. The firstly is that what a firm knows is based on its information processing procedures. These are procedures which either generate or retrieve information. They can be broken into two components. One is efficiency. So what's the expected cost in time or energy to run the procedure? Is it feasible? So an information process that took an infinity of time would not be one that generates knowledge which could be imputed to a corporation. But secondly, even though one may generate or retrieve information efficiently, there's this question of validated reliability. Is the information generated correct? Is it true and justifiable beliefs? I would argue that an information process that efficiently generates hallucinations is not one that ought to be able to attribute knowledge to a corporation of facts. So to this end, we want to know what's the end-to-end error rate. And just a preview of this kind of process. So in the paper, what I argue for is something like a metric for factoring efficiency and validation of these pipelines for information retrieval and gathering for establishing knowledge of a corporation with regard to a proposition phi. The idea is we have a metric S, which applies with respect to a procedure pi for generating a proposition phi. This is broken down to be composed of one factor, which is this efficiency factor, which I'll talk about shortly here, in terms of expected cost, and this expected error rate here. We then take a firm's best achievable score and use it as a basis for legal attribution. So just to recap, the idea of the paper is what a corporation knows is a function of whether the information can be acquired through search or generation efficiency, and whether the information acquired is sufficiently accurate. My framework aims to use this as a way of judging what companies knew or ought to have known when using information processing systems. These are some of the symbols. So where do we start with this thinking? Well, we start with this idea of the extended corporate mind as a collection of components. Now, there are different ways to slice and dice this, but I'll give you mine. So we can break down a corporation and classify it in terms of its data stores, how it indexes information, its retrieval procedures, if it has SQL databases, its generative procedures, is it using Copilot or other frontier models, what are its verification procedures, what are its sort of policy procedures in terms of admissible ways of acquiring and generating information? Not all processes are admissible. And what are some of the parameters that affect this concept of the corporate mind? The intuition is that a firm's cognitive architecture forms an extended cognition stack. And, I suppose importantly, the idea is that this can include both human but non-human synthetic artificial agentic AI systems. So what do I mean by pipeline? So a pipeline pi is a repeatable procedure that tries to establish a fact phi. So this comprises a retrieval procedure, which may also be a generative procedure. It then includes a procedure for verification, and then the output is fundamentally what you receive. So this is a general framework. So you can have a manual information procedure. So that may be, for example, coming back to the example I used before, to find out whether a reportable transaction has occurred, you may need to ask a branch for spreadsheets and do pen and paper reconciliation. You may, this is how it works currently, instead run a query against a SQL database and aggregate information by customer a day. And increasingly, we will see the use of AI agents to essentially run and generate these information pipelines. So how do we score the efficiency of information generation or retrieval? So one way is to sort of calculate something along the lines of expected cost. So what do we mean by this? Well, let's take a look at companies and think about what are the, where's the friction inside companies which may sort of generate or cause, information retrieval generation processes to be more or less efficient. Firstly, anyone here that's worked in a corporation or even a sort of academic context or anywhere really will know that there are often information silos. So it's not like all information is imminently accessible to all parts of a business. So that adds friction. Maybe we can measure that. We can also maybe measure what the search and retrieval time is. Running a SQL query against a very large database can take a long amount of time. In a generative sense, say you're using agents, we can look at the synthesis time. So for example, if you set Claude or Codex to high or low reasoning, that will affect how long it takes to generate the information. You can set GPT and Codex instantly generate, but that may then lead to problems with hallucination. And then, how long does it take to verify? These are all features of friction that go into the expected cost. So then we want to look at, okay, so we want to score a pipeline's effectiveness for knowledge. And this is, as I said, is a function of its efficiency and validity. So the idea there is to take this value of expected cost and a measure of how accurate it is, which I'll get to shortly. Fast but unreliable pipelines cause the score to drop. So the higher the score, the more likely it is that we can justifiably attribute the knowledge of phi, that phi was known or ought to have been known, because we have a high quality pipeline. But if we have a fast and unreliable pipeline, the score drops. Because the information that's generated may not be correct. Similarly, we may have a highly reliable pipeline, but it's too slow. If it took years to obtain information, then it is unlikely that a court would attribute that information, even though it could have been obtained, to a corporate mind. A lower score means that a procedure is not a quality procedure for acquiring information sufficiently quickly or reliably. A pipeline is knowledge-like when it is fast enough and reliable enough to generate information which can then be attributed to the corporate mind. So again, in this metric S, the first term is we are trying to find a measure of the total efficiency. Now, rather than just use the expected cost, I've wrapped this inside a function. What's the purpose there? We want the function to be bounded by some sort of epistemic value factor. The idea here is that the epistemic value of information for decision making diminishes as the time to retrieve it and validate it increases. So, the idea here is we want to compare the information procedure against maybe something comparative in the market or best practice, and how long that procedure ought to take in general. So we measure that sort of general measure of efficiency, of some information process by tau star. So for example, with trading and compliance safety alerts, you would want the ability to retrieve valid and accurate information to be very quick, else you may have a flash crash. If your information process is involved in a regulatory reporting procedure, you may have hours within which to file a reportable transaction. And if your internal investigation or audit, you may have weeks. And so the idea then is that we can weight the expected cost in some way by the sort of general expected cost for these procedures, again in the market, so that we are comparing a company's procedures against the state of the art. Again, the takeaway is that our function f here encodes the principle that information arriving too late to inform an action has diminished epistemic and therefore legal significance. The second component of this metric of our information pipelines is error. So I've broken this up into 4 components. Again, you could do this in various ways. So the first is coverage. So does the information actually exist? Is it in a database, or can your frontier model even generate it? If the answer is no, then the error may be quite high. There may be an error rate to do with information retrieval or generation, given the information may exist somewhere, but perhaps the information processing retrieval process has some sort of systematic error in it. Similarly, there may be generation error, hallucination or misrepresentation. And then again, there is a measure of how error-prone is the verification procedure. So it's quite common now to fall back on large language model judges when you're using agentic systems, but they themselves can be prone to error. So you want to say, what error does the verification process bring into this total question of how valid the information processing pipeline is? Okay, so we have a measure S of how high quality our information generating and validation procedure is. That's important to then base how we attribute knowledge. But a corporation may have several options available to it. You know, it may get the clerk to rifle through the filing cabinet to find information, or it may spin up a Claude instance to query across its information architecture. I argue that what a firm knows ought to be its best. It's the supremum of its potential procedures. This is a capability measure. How well can the firm establish FI? Here, the idea is we're baking in extended cognition. And so if a high-scoring pipeline for generating, retrieving, and validating, then capital S is high, even if a firm chose to not run it. The idea then is that you can look at a company, look at its procedures and say, what is the best information procedure here, not just the one you happen to use. And again, this is consistent with the way that courts often approach attribution of corporate knowledge. The thing is, the law is into binary classification quite often, and so the law needs a binary conclusion. So how do we go from this sort of continuous metric score to something which is binary that courts can use? And so the idea then is, well, we need a comparator. We need to say, well, if the quality of this information processing procedure is sufficiently high, so here, if that's above some threshold, then courts or others may then confidently claim that a corporation knew or ought to have known a particular fact. Of course, the devil's in the detail as to how on earth we could possibly get a number, theta here, which is a threshold above which a pipeline must reach for that pipeline to effectively constitute a way that we can justifiably attribute corporate knowledge. I suppose the point here is that parties can argue about what that threshold is using particular facts, maybe particular cost, comparison of market practice, rather than just sort of qualitatively try to assess whether or not a pipeline is high quality or not. So I'm very conscious that there's a lot of unknown here, but I'm just trying to give a framework as to how you convert from this concept of a metric of an information generating procedure to a binary classification that courts fundamentally use for judgment. So the idea is, if you have a chosen threshold theta and the firm's best pipeline score is higher, then KS here is 1, which means that the firm has the capacity to know in a way that the law could justifiably treat as the company knowing that fact phi. And then we can then extend this idea. So we can say, well, what is the total sort of set of facts or information that a company held? And so we can aggregate, which is what we've got here. We're summing over the facts. Whether a corporation did or did not know a particular set of facts, because for each fact, its procedure has been scored above some threshold. I also added a salience factor here because often what happens is we are interested in, for example, did a board take into account relevant information? And so we want a salience factor as to how relevant the fact phi was to the particular decision which was being made, not just, because not all information is relevant to whether a decision, to how a company ought to make decisions or whether it knew something. And again, this is a framework that tries to allow us to possibly quantify how the information generation and retrieval procedures affect corporate knowledge. And more broadly, I believe what this maybe points to is a way where we can think about corporate knowledge, as a frontier contingent, sorry for the typo, on the efficiency and error rates of the information processing procedures of this extended cognition structure called the corporation. So, and apologies, I probably should have drawn a diagram with some sort of Pareto frontier, but fundamentally we say that the frontier is a function of how efficient it can gather information and the total error. Better AI infrastructure, I claim, shifts the frontier. If your information processing is lower, so faster retrieval, better agentic training, and with lower error rates, better validation, then the frontier shifts. What the company knows is higher. It has a broader frontier of the set of information that it's aware of. And so, as the frontier moves, the baseline for what it can argue that it doesn't know, also changes. Effectively, it can be said to know more. I've talked about there are issues to do with silos and so on, which you can look at the paper on. Validation is central. Why is it central? Because courts are interested in known error rates. So when we're looking at expert evidence, for example, we are interested in, courts will look to the state of the art and look at things like error rates. And the idea here is, with the second term, is to sort of factor that in. There is some work in there about how we possibly bound and use some other more quantitative measures to provide upper and lower bounds on what corporations can or cannot know. I'm going to skip through that just in the interest of time. One important point is that I believe this sort of framework can then be used to generate certificates or some artifact that fundamentally tells you something, or tells the court something about how reliable, what the error rate for particular procedures are, what the error rate for coverage, and so on and so forth. And these certificates can then be used to make judgments about corporate knowledge attribution. Again, they are designed to make the corporate extended mind inspectable. Rather than just trying to rely on qualitative assessments, I believe going forward we may be able to rely on more quantitative assessments which can be testable. In the last few minutes, I just want to talk about how this actually maps to doctrines. The law has a very well-developed and sophisticated way, of attributing knowledge. And I want to make clear, my framework is not trying to replace this at all. It's about providing a way of thinking about how information processing and information theoretic ways of thinking about information can be used to used in the legal questions. So a firm can be said to actually know when it runs these pipeline and records the output. So a pipeline has been executed, and there is a certificate, for example, that exists that shows that the pipeline, is above the threshold I talked about earlier. The framework I've talked about can be used for constructive knowledge. Again, let's come back to this idea that a corporation has several procedures for obtaining information. A court can look, if there exists a low-cost, reliable pipeline, but it just wasn't run, then that can be the basis for constructive knowledge imputation. It shifts the argument from no one knew to the system could have known easily. So it's not just, an individual person didn't do their job. It's that the system could have been run overall. There are similar arguments in terms of other criteria for knowledge attribution, which you can look at in the paper. So just to finish, the key takeaways here. In this paper, I've argued that we can use the theory of extended mind and extended cognition to treat corporate cognition as a form of extended cognition. This includes people artifacts. Those can then be inputs into a concept of what a corporation knows is a function of its procedural capability. How efficiently and how accurately can it obtain information? This is a function of certain features which I've talked about in the paper. And the idea fundamentally is that as we integrate AI into these systems, the bounds of what a corporation knows in principle can expand, and therefore what it may be liable for can expand. I'd love you to reach out if this is of interest. For any comments or criticisms, please reach out on email below. Thank you.